Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's program. I'm Julie Stoner, and I'm a member of the Friends of the Montana Society Historical Volunteer Group. Today, we're going to introduce Kate Hampton. She is the Community Preservation Officer at the Montana Historical Society's State Historic Preservation Office, where she works directly with local community preservation programs to document and preserve their cultural resources. Her past work includes several years with the Montana Preservation Alliance, now Preserve Montana, as the director of the Most Endangered Places program, work as a partner in the field for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, coordinating Montana's National Register of Historic Places program, and working throughout the West as a research historian with Historic Research Associates Incorporated. She also directs the nationally recognized Identifying Montana's African American Heritage Resources projects, which identify, research, and document resources and places throughout the state associated with African American history. Most recently, she authored The Best Gift, Montana's Carnegie Libraries, with the Montana History Foundation. She received her undergraduate degree in history from Towson State University and completed the Master's in History program at the University of Montana, Missoula. Make sure your cell phones are silenced, and please welcome Kate.
Thank you, Julie. Oh, it's so nice to be here. It's been a little while since I was in front of this podium, so it's nice to be back and talking about one of my first favorite projects. Actually, we started doing this research about the history of paleontology in Montana about 9 years ago. So it's been fun to kind of review this research and be able to report on some progress we've made in recognizing these important places across the state associated with the history of science, which is kind of always fun. You know, I have kids, and of course every kid goes through a dinosaur phase, right? And for probably a year, my son was convinced he was a velociraptor and would only hiss at people when we would go out and about, so I didn't take him out in public very much. But I really got into it. You know, he loved it, and so I loved it. And so I had these wonderful dreams of when he went off to college, I'd go too, and we would study together, and we'd be roommates at MSU. And I'd tell him all about this, and now he absolutely can't stand dinosaurs and wants nothing to do with me. I think I might have scared him off his dinosaur obsession for a little while. So now I have to find other ways to explore it. And so it's fun to do that here today with all of you. One of the reasons I got involved with this particular site, which is in Fergus County, Montana, is that we were looking at expanding a National Register historic district. The Judith Landing Historic District kind of is right where the confluence of the Judith River and the Missouri River, and actually spans the river, goes on either side, includes a place called Council Island, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But we wanted to expand that historic district and tell another story that took place there. Back in 2013, we were looking at expanding this historic district, so that's where we kind of developed this context. As you can see from this photograph, as we're overlooking, you can see to the left of the picture where Council Island is in the middle of the Missouri. And the site we're going to be concentrating on or highlighting in this particular talk is the Hayden site, and it's up Dog Creek, a few miles up from the river. And it's just, as you can see, very beautiful and difficult terrain, kind of the Badlands of the Missouri, we call it. So the first time I gave this talk, I was in Sidney, Montana, up where the Bakken, we have all kinds of energy, and I had to figure out a way to connect, this discussion with Sidney, Montana, and so this is what I came up with. Let's see if I can get my thing to work. And that's that understanding, right, that that the energy sources that are so important to the Montana economy now essentially started with dinosaurs, right? Because they are those carbon remains that now we're extracting from the earth. So it's been a long tradition, and it continues to be an important part of Montana's life and history. These ancient creatures that used to traverse our land. So during the late Cretaceous period, maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about how the dinosaurs came to be in this particular part of the world. So during the part of the late Cretaceous period, which is about 65 million years ago, the Western Interior Seaway connected the Gulf of Mexico with the Arctic Ocean through the center of North America. Flora and fauna abounded, both in the oceans and on the land, and the fossils which we now can find in the beds above the Judith River formed along these shores. And as we know, these organic materials also became the petroleum deposits we derive our energy from today. So the fossil beds I will talk about today are part of the Judith River Formation, a geological unit dating to the Upper Cretaceous period and rich in paleontological sites. On this map, produced by Ferdinand Hayden in 1860, you see the green areas, in particular, represent Cretaceous rocks, so that 65 million year ago kind of date of the rocks. And this is a big picture of the Intermountain West and Montana, and maybe we can zoom in a little bit closer, and you'll be able to see kind of the Missouri River running along here, and the Judith River, where it dumps into the Missouri right along here. So this is the spot where we're looking, and as you can see, it's all nice and dark green, so it's got that rich, wonderful Cretaceous rock that we want to see. So I'll start a little bit with the beginnings of paleontology. So evidence unearthed from the ancient archaeological sites across Europe show that even from the time of Neanderthals, humans have known about and been intrigued by fossils of even more ancient creatures. European schools of thought that explain the existence of fossils evolved through millennia. Greek philosopher Aristotle pointed to fossils and thought that they were incomplete creatures, spontaneously generated by inorganic processes within an internal and an unchanging earth. So they just kind of spontaneously appeared in the earth when the earth was created, and they've been there for all time in that state. Some middle-aged Europeans thought that fossils were the work of the devil, creatures that were ill-formed or never quite made it to the surface of the earth because the devil wasn't as good as God was, right? Many Christians believed, and some still do, that they represent species that perished during Noah's flood or some other worldwide catastrophes. In Asia, some cultures identified fossils as the remains of dragons. During the 11th century, Chinese scientist and statesman Shen Kuo found marine fossils in the Taihang Mountains and theorized on geological processes, including geomorphology and the shifting of seashores over time. Shen observed petrified bamboo obtained from a dry climate, and that area didn't support bamboo growth anymore. And so by studying this, he argued for a theory of gradual climate change. As Europeans emerged from the Middle Ages, even more scientific approaches to the study of natural history began to develop. By the mid-1400s, a few scholars, including Leonardo da Vinci, recognized fossils as the remains of extinct ancient life. In the 1600s, Danish scholar Nicholas Steno recognized the stratified nature of the earth and superposition, or whereby older rocks underlay newer layers. Concurrently, naturalists more widely began to embrace the idea that fossils were examples of extinct creatures and plants, though the vast majority failed to recognize how ancient they actually were. And they continued to assume that they existed at the time of Genesis. By the late 18th century, Georges Cuvier, often called the father of paleontology, posited extinction as fact and made great strides in comparative anatomy, theorizing the idea of functional integration, which is kind of this technical term, but it's important to kind of grasp the concept of this functional integration, which means that each part of an organism, no matter how small, bore signs of the whole. Thus, it was possible to reconstruct organisms from fragmentary remains. So you have just a toe bone, right? But you understand how anatomy works, how bones fit together by studying other creatures and comparing them. And if you just have a toe bone, you can still really understand how the whole foot must have looked. And building on that, you're going to be able to build an idea of what these creatures look like, even though you have very fragmentary remains of the creature itself. Many of his reconstructions turned out to be strikingly accurate. Cuvier's work, together with the work of other scholars, instigated a wave of fossil collection and identification. By 1822, the editor of the Journal de Physique coined the term paleontology in reference to study of fossilized organisms. The broader understanding of geological forces also developed during the early 1800s, including the principles of erosion and deposition. This understanding culminated in Charles Lyell's seminal two-volume Principles of Geology in 1830 and 1833. Lyell also theorized on evolution and heavily influenced Charles Darwin. So you know all of these wonderful scientific discoveries and ideas are really kind of culminating together in the early 1800s that lead to these wonderful discoveries or theories that we still associate with today, right? The theory of evolution is very important to our understanding of how the world came to be what it is. In 1842, Darwin's colleague Sir Richard Owen, also a scholar of comparative anatomy, was the first to define the taxon Dinosauria. Indeed, the scientific strides made in the areas of geology, comparative anatomy, and by naturalists during the late 18th and early 19th centuries were revolutionary. Progress in geology, natural history, and paleontology extended beyond Europe. Interest in the fields grew, particularly in North America, where a number of geological and natural history societies, such as the American Philosophical Society, provided a scholarly outlet to, quote, cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge. By the early 1800s, scientists could find work at universities, museums, and on private and governmental geological surveys. Not only were the sciences increasingly popular, the geologists and naturalists provided vast amounts of information regarding the continent's natural resources and their potential for economic development, right? If we think about the Lewis and Clark expedition in particular, because this is a talk about Montana and you can't get through it without talking at least for a moment about Lewis and Clark. But really, it's very relevant because the Lewis and Clark expedition was a military expedition, was an expedition of exploration, but it was also an economic exploration. We needed to know what was out here. Jefferson wanted to know what the potential for economic development was, and geology was a big part of that, and identifying different species was a big part of that as well. This understanding of mapping this new huge area that has very recently become part of the United States. So savvy politicians recognized this and sent expeditions westward to explore the North American continent. Though these journeys were often military expeditions, the sponsors placed great emphasis on geology and identifying and collecting the flora and fauna. In the United States, the Centers for Natural Science Studies included the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where Joseph Leidy served as one of the leading naturalists in the nation, and the Smithsonian Institution, where by 1850, Spencer Fulton Baird worked to establish a national museum with massive collections, and the New York Geological Survey, which employed leading geologist James Hall. So we have these people in these kind of centers of science on the East Coast, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C., that on the appearance, on the surface appear to be kind of these convivial, they might debate a little bit on these high scholarly levels, but they're really in competition with each other, as we will see. They want the most stuff, and they want to fill their coffers in their buildings full of stuff, and it gets quite competitive and a little nasty through the 19th century. So these three men, especially, if we're looking at it, if we look at Leedy, Baird, and Hall, are going to be big players when it comes to the evolution of the science of paleontology through the 19th century. And they greatly influenced the aspiring geologist and naturalist named Ferdinand van der Hayden. So let's talk a little bit about Mr. Hayden. There he is. Hayden spent his childhood in Massachusetts, New York State, and Ohio. Born in 1828 or 29, the accounts vary, young Ferdinand lived with his parents for his first decade and then moved with his mother and siblings to Rochester, New York, when his parents separated. And then when his mother remarried in 1841, she sent Ferdinand to live with an aunt in Ohio. She had this new life. She had this new husband, and she didn't want to bother with her son. So she sent them along, and that created quite a bit of unrest and a little, not a small amount of resentment in our friend Ferdy over here. And he really kind of reacted to this tumultuous childhood with this drive for adventure and wanting, and a restlessness, right? So we can thank issues of abandonment and mistrust for this wonderful scientist that was born out of all of that. Yeah, he's an interesting character. There's several books written about him from a kind of a psychological history point of view that are fascinating. Anyway, he ends up in Ohio, and in 1845, he traveled to Oberlin, Ohio, to continue his education. And while at Oberlin, he studied geology under George Allen, who was a proponent of natural theology, which was the leading approach to the natural sciences. So they didn't want to separate science entirely from their religious beliefs at this point, at least George Allen didn't. And so he taught that the deliberate and powerful design of the Creator was responsible for the entire universe in all its detail and complexity, and that the role of natural history was to discover and illustrate that design in nature. So Allen's instruction emphasized classification and description of the natural world, of these wonderful things that the Creator has given us on this earth. Upon his graduation in 1850, Hayden supported himself by teaching, but he didn't like it very much. And he enrolled in Oberlin's theology department because he kind of wanted to hang around. It was a college town, lots of pretty girls. He had lots of nice girlfriends, and he enjoyed being in Oberlin, and he really didn't know what to do. While there were expeditions and there were these few museums, really there wasn't a ton of work for an aspiring naturalist in 1850s United States. So the following year, he attended classes at the Cleveland Medical School. And he did this because really it's the best place to study anatomy, right? It's really one of those best opportunities to continue his studies in natural history and learn more about biology. There, his mentors introduced him to James Hall, one of our friends from before, one of the big guys, right? Who at a young age had established himself at the Geological Survey in New York. Hall invited Hayden to complete his studies in Albany in 1853, and the two, together with Hall's assistant, Fielding Bradford Meek, began planning an expedition to Nebraska Territory to collect fossils. And at this time, remember, Nebraska Territory is a huge swath through the middle of what would become, what is North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and Kansas now. It's kind of that whole from the Mississippi River all the way over to the Rocky Mountains is Nebraska territory at this period of time. So Hayden formed these alliances with Meek and with Hall, the New York crew, but at the same time he established connections to the Smithsonian, Spencer Fullerton Baird, and naturalist Joseph Leidy, and looked to them as potential mentors as well. So you have these kind of three factions, three centers of intellect, and Hayden is an opportunist, and he's going to look toward all of them as potential financiers and supporters of his work. He's not going to choose just one. He might even play a few off of each other, as we'll see. So Meek and Hayden undertook their trip west, privately sponsored by Hall, in May of 1853, and they arrived at Fort Pierre in mid-June. They traveled with a rival surveying party under the leadership of Governor Isaac Stevens, who sought practical railroad routes through the area. Also on the boat to Fort Pierre were American Fur Company Representative Alexander Culbertson, we know the name Culbertson, Montana, right? And Indian agent Alfred Vaughn. The trip not only provided Hayden with essential contacts among leading naturalists, collectors, businessmen, and government surveyors, it also provided him with a personal understanding of the potential of scientific discovery in the American West. Though their trip was fraught with trouble and cut short, people got sick, they didn't really get very far. Meek and Hayden did return to Albany in July of 1853 with a remarkable collection of fossils. They were just digging everything up, sticking it in boxes, putting it on a boat down the river, and then on from St. Louis back east. So the collection impressed Baird at the Smithsonian and Leidy in Philadelphia, right? So and those two kind of recognized this guy as, hey, he can get the job done. He knows where to go, how to recognize geology, and how to collect stuff. And so they decided that they were going to support Hayden's subsequent expeditions. And Hayden was eager to return west, and he arranged to spend 1854 and 1855 exploring the Missouri River country. He garnered the support of Vaughn, the Indian agent, and Baird from the Smithsonian, who helped finance the trip. And he arrived with Vaughn at Fort Union at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers in July of 1854. They traveled an additional 300 miles up the Yellowstone to Fort Sarpy, meeting with members of the Crow Nation. Along the way, Hayden collected literally tons of fossils to be sent back east for Leidy and Baird's collections. He remained in the Missouri River country with Vaughn, spending the winter of 1854 and 55 at Fort Pierre, and taking opportunities to explore the White River and surrounding areas in what would become the Dakotas. By the summer of 1855, Hayden had grown as a seasoned explorer, and Culbertson invited him on a trip up the Missouri to Fort Union and on to Fort Benton. Previous explorations in Missouri country, including Lewis and Clark's travels, Joseph Nicholas Nicolet in 1839, Prince Newid's adventures with Carl Bodmer in 1833, as well as discoveries by employees of fur trading outfits, provided reliable indications of Cretaceous fossil-yielding formations, but did not constitute complete studies of the area's geology. Remember that geologic map that I showed you from 1860. So this is 5 years before he was able to produce that map. So Hayden wanted to get his hands on fossils, and he was going to tag along with anybody who would take him to do so. And he also wanted to do and complete that more complete study of geology in the Missouri River area. So in July 1855, Hayden and his traveling companions arrived at Fort Union, and from there the group traveled on keelboats and mackinaws. The party included Colonel Alfred Cumming, who is head of the Office of Indian Affairs Central Superintendency. And Cumming is important because he's also working with Isaac Stevens, the great surveyor, Governor Isaac Stevens, who wants to find a way to build a railroad across all of this land. And building a railroad requires indigenous nations to agree to let them build this railroad across their lands, right? So while Hayden and Cumming are coming up the Missouri, intent on meeting our Governor Stevens, Stevens is arranging for a massive meeting of tribal representatives, 10,000 they're expecting, at Fort Benton. So the idea is that they're going to all kind of converge on Fort Benton in July of 1855 and have this very important meeting. And Hayden's along for the ride. So Cumming has another job to do, right? He's with the Office of Indian Affairs. So he figures while he's on the Missouri, he's just going to stop by and drop off supplies at these different agencies along the way and kind of take his time. So, and he was also bringing supplies for this big Blackfoot Council, right? That was supposed to happen actually in August, excuse me, I misspoke, at Fort Benton. So he was supposed to meet Isaac Stevens, and Stevens is becoming very, very frustrated at the time that Cumming is taking to make it up the river. He's kind of dawdling and enjoying his lovely summer trip on the water. And Hayden's all for this, right? Because he's like, the slower you go, the more chance I have to jump off the boat and go and collect more rocks and send them back. So he has no problem with it. But against Stevens' advice, Cumming had contracted with the American Fur Company's steamboat St. Mary to transport treaty goods to Fort Union. And from where they had to be cordled up the river on keelboats, battling seasonally low water. So the longer they take, the lower the water is, and the harder it is for them to get these heavily laden boats up the river. So problem is compounding problem here. Because the company was delivering trade goods to its own posts too, the journey to Fort Union had already been slowed, and Cumming had then caused additional delay by using the trip to distribute those annuity goods on the lower Missouri. So Hayden is like, this is great. And he writes to his friend Meek from Fort Union in July of 1855, and he writes, I am now at this place on my way to Fort Benton in Blackfoot country, 780 miles from this place by water. I expect to have a grand time of it, and in addition, I will be at the treaty with the Blackfeet. Colonel Cumming, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, goes to Blackfeet. He proposes to attach me to his corps. This would give me a fine chance. What to do about it, I don't know. Perhaps it would be best for the purpose of connecting the geology of the Missouri with the Mississippi and determining more fully the boundaries of the Cretaceous and the Tertiary. So, he's being asked to join this important core treaty-making group of people in this incredibly poignant and important time period. This is all of the railroads across the West, or at least through the northern tier, are hinging on this treaty. And really, all Hayden cares about is his mission and his goal of finding more fossils, as many as he can, and boxing them up and sending them back. So the region along the Missouri upriver from Fort Benton was new to Hayden. Geologically, it had never been studied. And he came to call this country the Badlands of the Judith. Let's see if I get my, yes, so he's in the Badlands of the Judith and the Badlands of the Upper Missouri. In all, he traversed nearly 800 miles in a little over a month and is thought to have arrived at Fort Benton on August 17, 1855, in the company of Cumming. From July 12th to December 8th, we don't have any letters or journal entries from Hayden, leaving much of his path of exploration through the far west shrouded in mystery. He had hoped to visit the mountains of neighboring Fort Benton and may have spent time exploring the country until the fall. His presence on the journey and the council is confirmed by other sources and references to the trip, and by Hayden in his later letters and reports. So here we have the heavily laden keelboats and Mackinaws arrived at the confluence of the Judith and Missouri rivers in mid-October. Hayden had gone ahead, and they went back to rejoin his group on the boat. And the commissioners resolved to relocate the planned council there. Remember, they were supposed to meet in August, and this is mid-October, so you can imagine Isaac Stevens, not to mention the tribal members, are kind of annoyed that this boat with all of the supplies for this meeting doesn't arrive. And so what was supposed to be 10,000 people gathering is now down to about 3,500, but it's still a pretty good group of people. But at this point, Isaac Stevens like, no way, stay there. You don't move, we're coming to you. So he picks up everybody from Fort Benton and moves them back to Council Island, what becomes Council Island, at the confluence of the Judith and the Missouri. And now I have to ask you guys to wave your hands around so that the lights come back on. There they are. Well done. It's a participation talk. So there they are, and they finally arrive. Everybody's together, including representatives from the Piegan, Blood, Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, Salish, Upper Pend Oreille, Kootenai, Nez Perce, and Cree nations. Hayden served as a paid member of the commission when the council began its main deliberations on October 16, 1855. By some accounts, it looks like he earned about $10 as a commission member. And over the next 2 days, he didn't really earn it. Over the next 2 days, the commissioners negotiated with the tribes present. And from October 19th through the 21st, the Indian agents distributed goods to the tribe. But Hayden kind of cut out of that whole deal, and he departed the council ground on the 22nd on a vessel heading downstream towards home. Over those few days, Hayden explored some of the most remote and fossil-bearing country on the earth. The 75-million-year-old outcrops of the Judith River Formation, easily accessed from Council Island near the mouths of the Judith River and Dog Creek. Hayden's exploration of the Judith River Formation Badlands resulted in new assemblages of Cretaceous fossils from both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. In all, Hayden recognized that over the course of his travels through the upper Missouri country, he had discovered hundreds of new species. So there's an example of the boats that they were traveling on. And here's the country that they're traveling through. It's just incredible landscape. And he writes back in December. We have a letter not until December, but he's writing to the Smithsonian Spencer Baird, the supporter of the expedition, and he said, "I made a small, but I think will prove valuable collection of vertebrate remains." Hayden shipped the vertebrate fossils from the Judith River Formation to the Spencer Baird with the understanding that they would be forwarded to Joseph Leidy. Remember, Baird's at the Smithsonian, Leidy's in Philadelphia, one of his scientific sponsors and a well-respected comparative anatomist. So here's just a nice drawing of the Blackfoot Council in 1855. And here's his collection that he has gotten from this spot along Dog Creek, up above that Council Island. So he sends back these boxes and boxes. He knows he's got important stuff in there. And Leidy publishes a book. He had published Ancient Fauna of Nebraska in 1853 and was considered the leading North American paleontologist. Apparently, Baird understood the magnitude of Hayden's find, writing to Leidy that some specimens, quote, would make your eyes water. In March 1856, Leidy published a description of the remains collected by Hayden in the Judith River Formation. Among them were the teeth of ankylosaurs, hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and at least 2 different types of theropod dinosaur, some crocodile teeth, turtle shell fragments, and scales of garfish. These fossils hold the distinction as the first skeletal remains of dinosaurs identified in North America, on that little remote part of Montana, the very, very first dinosaurs.
And what year was that?
And this is 1855. Same time as that Council Island. Because of that Council Island meeting, really. So Leidy's report, as you can understand, would cause a great sensation. They're like, oh my gosh, dinosaurs were here too. And Hayden's 1862 report on the geology and natural history of the upper Missouri provided even more stimulus. People are getting really excited because everybody loves dinosaurs, right? Even back then. And because everybody needs pictures of dinosaurs, here are some of the dinosaurs that he found. So we have ankylosaur, chomposaur, some theropods, some quite large creatures. The chomposaur is kind of an ancient crocodile type. But of course, we're only finding little bits and pieces, right? So he's working off of his theories of anatomy and comparative anatomy to build this idea of what these creatures must have looked like, and understanding that they were very ancient forms of life. So Hayden continues to explore the West, securing positions in government topographical surveys, including the Reynolds expedition to the Upper Yellowstone in 1859 and 1860. And after the Civil War, Hayden returned west. Remember, he actually took a break during the Civil War and was called back. And because he had received medical training at the Cleveland Medical College, he was an unlikely doctor and served as a doctor during the Civil War. So he kind of had that break in the early 1860s. Wasn't really a nice break, but a break from his explorations. But by 1867, he served as geologist in charge of the United States Geological and Geographical Survey of the territories. In this position, he returned to the Missouri and Yellowstone country, leading the expedition to what would become Yellowstone Park in 1871. Perhaps some of you have visited the famous Hayden Valley, pictured here. In 1877, he issued a geological and geographical atlas of Colorado, and his explorations resulted in a valuable series of volumes on all branches of natural history and economic science. And he keeps wanting, he's out there for the science. He's not out there for the military, but he kind of hooks himself to that star. So he has to keep generating these reports so that the government will continue to employ him and finance these surveys. So he always is looking to combine that mission with proving the economic value of these places in the West. Where is the farmland? Where is potential for mining? And reporting that back to the government. Or where are places that are so special they should never be developed, like Yellowstone. So his explorations resulted in a valuable series of volumes on all branches of history that were being studied by other people interested in natural history. So by the late 1870s, there's this new generation of naturalists, including a gentleman named Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, and they began to dominate the scene when it comes to early paleontology in the United States. A contender for the directorship of the newly formed United States Geological Survey in 1879, political infighting and Hayden's failing health kept him from receiving the appointment. He returned to Montana in the mid-1880s, working as a government geologist, and passed away here in Montana in 1877. As a result of Hayden's extensive geological work, numerous dinosaur fossils were uncovered and brought back east for further scientific study, and much of what he brought back is still housed in the collection of the Smithsonian. Just 2 years after Leidy's report on the Hayden's collection was published in 1858, W. Parker Folk uncovered a nearly complete dinosaur skeleton, Hadrosaurus foucaulti, Leidy, in Haddonfield, New Jersey. We don't really think of New Jersey usually when we think of dinosaurs, but this swept the scene. Hayden's might have been the first, but it was all these kind of fragmented bones. You couldn't really put them on tour and have people ooh and ah about them because you couldn't really see the vision that was the whole dinosaur. But now, with this discovery, people can actually understand the magnitude of these creatures and how big they were. So Leidy joined Folk in the excavation and went on to describe it, publishing his findings in the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia and the Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge. The find became even more popular in 1868 when Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins assembled the skeleton for display. By the 1860s and 70s, the race among naturalists to find collections of dinosaur fossils, preferably large caches and nearly complete skeletons, accelerated. So everybody wanted to be part of this sensation, even though they were kind of assembling them wrong, right? So we have the creature on the left-hand side, and that's its original kind of how they put them together in the 1860s. But in fact, they didn't stand on their back legs, and this is the correctly posed hadrosaur. So several of these expeditions now in the 1870s traveled through the same badlands that Hayden had been. In 1875, Colonel William Ludlow led his Corps of Engineers expedition on the Carroll Trail in Montana. Party members included George Bird Grinnell and Edward Dana of Yale College. And they traversed the Dog Creek Badlands in September of 1875, so 20 years after Hayden had been there. And they described the area. And they said, "The beds of the mouth of the Judith have been explored only once before by Dr. Hayden, and their age has hitherto been in doubt. We were able to remain but 2 days in this interesting locality. Enough, however, was seen to establish the age of the beds at this point as beyond a doubt Cretaceous. The Badlands on Dog Creek stretch back into the bluffs for about 15 miles, running over to meet those of the Judith for about 6 miles of this distance." On their journey, Dana and Grinnell took copious notes describing the geology of the area, and they collected numerous fossils as well, and they were sent to Marsh for identification. From the Judith Landing area, they collected and discovered remains of dinosaurs, including hadrosaurs, turtles, and invertebrates. So just a year later, in August and September of 1876, Edward Drinker Cope undertook a private expedition to the upper Missouri for the express purpose of finding fossils. So they're not even pretending at this point to be any kind of service to the government. This is all about them and their fame and their glory. And he was seeking, quote, the area from which Hayden had sent Leedy dinosaur fragments in the 1850s. And Cope is this really competitive guy. In the meantime, and he had a couple guys with him, a guy named Sternberg and a guy named Isaac, traveled with him and helped him with this work. So Cope and his party arrived in Helena via stagecoach from Ogden, and from there traveled to Fort Benton and then on to Judith Landing. And Sternberg wrote of their arrival, "We crossed the Missouri, here a clear, sparkling stream, and the Judith River, and went into camp in the narrow valley of Dog Creek, in the midst of fossil fields, which we had come so far and taken such risks to explore. On top of the Badlands were the Judith River beds. Here tablelands and level prairies offered plenty of grass for our ponies. So we climbed to these new heights, picketed our horses, and went into the gorges searching for fossils. It was necessary to give the loose shale the most careful examination, as only a streak of dust, a little different color from the uniform black around it, indicated where the bones were buried." More interested in finding large caches of fossils rather than isolated bones and teeth, Cope moved his party downstream. There they set their sights on new terrain and moved approximately 30 miles east to explore in the vicinity of Cow Island. There, they had better luck and discovered the remains of a horned dinosaur in the upper Cretaceous Judith River Formation, which became known as Mononchleus crassus. These bones are now thought to be juvenile skeletons of Centrosaurus or Strichosaurus. And so these are kind of in the whole same family as our Triceratops. Obviously, they don't have 3 horns, but this is a whole new creature in the taxonomy of dinosaurs in the 1870s. So inspired by Hayden, Dana, and Grinnell, and Cope, several other parties set out for Missouri River country. In 1888, Cope's rival, Charles Marsh, sent paleontologist John Bell Hatcher to the Judith River Formation area, and Hatcher collected hadrosaur and ceratopsian remains from the Cow Creek area east of Judith Landing. So Marsh and Cope really didn't like each other. I mean, to the point of, this is the basis of what we call the fossil wars, or the bone wars of the West. And these two were incredibly angry rivals and pretty miserable people, if you ask me. And they both wanted to fulfill this destiny of being the most famous fossil hunter in the West. And they often did things to undermine the others, to the point where they would run and rush to a site, gather as many bones and as many rocks as they possibly could, and if they couldn't get them all off and shipped east before the other one was to follow, the other survey crew came to the area, they would dynamite it. They would rather destroy it rather than have their rival have any chance of digging or learning from it. So some really, it wasn't about the science really for them, I don't think. But Rebecca Hanna is a great paleontologist in Montana, and she explained that there was this intense rivalry between Professors Marsh and Cope during the late 1800s, resulting in competition for specimens, collection areas, and the number of publications. In 1892, Hatcher collected more vertebrate material from the Missouri River breaks from Marsh, including fossil bird remains. With the deaths of Cope in 1897 and Marsh in 1899, the fossil feud began to wane somewhat, although there was still a fairly intensive competition between various East Coast museums for acquisition and display of specimens. In 1903, Hatcher undertook 2-month field investigations with T.W. Stanton to figure out the age of north-central Montana's Judith River Formation. Exploring the area west of the Judith Landing area, Stanton and Hatcher collected and described fossilized remains of vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants. So now we're getting up, moving through time a little bit. And in 1914, Charles Sternberg returned to Judith River country with his paleontologist son, Charles M. Sternberg, and Mr. D.B. Dowling of the Geological Survey of Canada. They said, "I spent 10 days in the Judith River country going over the same region walked over in 1876 as that he had been there previously as Professor Cope's assistant. After camping on Taffy Creek, a tributary east of Dog Creek, the group ended up in the Cow Island region. They said, we followed the same trail first traveled by Professor Cope down to the prairie level near Cow Island, getting water at Lone Tree Spring, as in 1876, and we camped near our old camp on the Missouri River. So in the vicinity of Taffy Creek, Sternberg collected a vast variety of marine animal teeth and scales, as well as dinosaur bones. As the 20th century progressed, paleontological investigations continued across north-central Montana. Flamboyant fossil collector Barnum Brown arrived during the late 1890s, and in 1902 uncovered the first Tyrannosaurus rex remains in the Hell Creek Formation in the Missouri Breaks. Brown continued his Hell Creek excavations over the next 8 years, and he returned again to the Great Falls area in 1936. Brown's discovery of Deinonychus in southeastern Montana in 1931 proved to be, after further excavations and description, one of the most important finds in paleontology of the 20th century. Prior to the 1940s, expeditions typically focused on acquisition of large display quality skeletons. Collectors usually identified the formation from which they acquired their finds, but the field crew would not always have the time or the ability to place them within a particular part of the formation. So they knew it was enough to say this was Cretaceous, rather than looking at the stratigraphy and having that kind of careful excavation that we think of modern paleontologists doing today. It was still about get out there, get as much as you can, and get out. And while we're talking about Barnum, he's got a lot written about his flamboyant attitudes. He liked to wear fur coats even when it was 100 degrees in Hell Creek, Montana. He liked to look good, and he liked kind of being this almost, his name is Barnum. You always wonder if he's part of the circus family, because you always kind of see him as this kind of out there guy who made a big deal of his expeditions. But he also had this dirty little secret that wasn't quite secret, and that is that he was kind of a fetishist, and that he liked dinosaur feet. And so, according to a worker at the American Museum of Natural History, it's an open secret in the paleontological community. And here's the evidence: a valentine given to colleagues by Brown with a winking acknowledgement of his strange fascination. World War II effectively halted the search for vertebrates in the West at mid-century. When they began again in the 1960s, expeditions had multifaceted goals and employed some different collection methods, including screening. During the mid-1960s, a team of paleontologists from the American Museum of Natural History explored the Judith River Formation in Choteau and Blaine counties. And there they collected remains of large and small vertebrates and described the area's stratigraphy. After 1968 and through the early 1990s, several expeditions focused on the Bear Gulch limestone area in southeastern Fergus County. Subsequent work focused farther east along the Rocky Mountain front, or west, that would be west, sorry, along the Rocky Mountain front. And an exciting find occurred in 1978. Marion Brandvold and Jack Horner discovered baby duck-billed dinosaur bones and eggshell exposures in the Two Medicine Formation west of Choteau. While affiliated with Princeton University and then later with the Museum of the Rockies, Horner undertook extensive studies of the Two Medicine Formation along the Rocky Mountain front, which began with this discovery and still continues to the day. And so this is how I became involved in this history. So we have the Judith Landing Historic District, which is huge and straddles both Fergus and Choteau counties there in that Council Island area. And it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places for several reasons. It's just this amazing confluence of layers of history that range from very, very ancient human occupation through, the first contact area of non-Indigenous peoples arriving in Montana. We've got history of woodcutters and settlements along this area providing wood for the steamships that were coming up to Fort Benton. There's one of the oldest post offices in the state is there at that confluence along what is now the PN Ranch. So we have this very early history of ranching in Montana, association with steamboats. And so we already had layers and layers and layers of history, but nobody had noted this history of paleontology that's also included in this landscape. And so we decided to move forward with this and actually increase this very large historic district so that we could tell this story more fully and have it documented a little bit more completely. So I worked with the Bureau of Land Management and a group of paleontologists and students from Manchester College to move that documentation forward, Manchester from Minnesota. So the Judith Landing Historic District includes a rugged landscape along the Missouri River. And in 1975, approximately 15 square miles of the property, now located within the National Monument boundary, were listed in the National Register. And the district encompasses the valley around the confluence of the rivers and the mouth of Dog Creek and extends to Missouri's Dead Bend Rapids at its west edge to the Holmes Council Islands to the east. So the boundary increase area, which is outlined in black here, includes the approaches to the Hayden site, the area explored by Hayden and subsequent paleontologists in the late 19th and early 20th century, and on to the Hayden site itself. So here's the Dog Creek drainage. I have never been in good enough shape to hike up there. I was very glad when a bunch of college kids managed to do it. But this drainage provides a natural trail leading from its mouth up to the rugged breaks above the Missouri River. And in October 1855, Ferdinand Hayden followed these narrow drainages, ridges, and animal trails, where he explored the exposed outcrops of ancient fossil beds. So when they were doing this documentation and trying to find what was the Hayden site in particular, they were able to say, if I were Hayden and I was on Council Island, I'd go this way. And it really was this kind of natural corridor up to these breaks and up these sandy slopes and gullies. So in June 2012, paleontologist Christina Curry Rogers and geologist Raymond R. Rogers, working with the Bureau of Land Management, brought a group of paleontology students from Macalester College on an expedition to the Missouri Breaks. They set out to explore the exposures of the Judith River Formation in the vicinity of Council Island and to try and retrace Hayden's steps. The survey team sought to identify the site from which Hayden gathered his Judith River Formation dinosaur collections in 1855, so that earliest identification of dinosaur fossils in North America. Just south of Council Island, on the right bank of the Missouri River, between the mouths of Dog Creek and the Judith River, they identified several locations that yielded vertebrate fossils, but only one with a concentration similar to that collected by Hayden in 1855 and reported in 1856. They discovered the remains of disarticulated partial skeleton of a hadrosaur, kind of that duck-billed dinosaur that we think of. And that included several broken limbs, pedal elements, as well as vertebrae and ribs. In addition, they recovered pieces of plastron, carapace, limb bones of turtles, crocodile teeth, and vertebrae. And the vertebra of the champsosaur, scales of garfish, and the teeth of hadrosaur and theropod dinosaurs. So what they collected really was almost identical to the species that Hayden had collected in 1855. The team returned in August 2012 to continue their survey towards the Dog Creek drainage. Though they identified other localities in the vicinity that yielded fossils, none exhibited the diversity of fauna and the size and range of skeletal remains that match Hayden's original find more closely than that first place that they excavated. And here are some site overviews of the area. So this is the view to the northeast from the site. And way in the distance there, you can see where the clumps of trees are in a line. Along here is the Missouri. And we're looking down to the entrance road to the PN Ranch from there. Here's a picture of the students there at the Hayden site itself. You can see it's very steep. I would have been very nervous that they were going to fall. Another view to the northwest. And here's one of those bones that they eventually unearthed as they found it in the ground. And so this is more of that boundary increase, that area in the map that we had colored in black. And that's one of my favorite pictures. Get a really good understanding of how huge this area really is up from the ridgeline. Oops. So what we can conclude is that Ferdinand Hayden's trek to the Dog Creek drainage in 1855, inspiring the next 150 years of study. His small collection of the first dinosaur fossils found in North America sparked the interest of naturalists and fossil hunters and contributed to the science of paleontology significantly. His work and the descriptions by Leedy in 1856 inspired governmental, university, and private expeditions to the Missouri River breaks and the greater Montana's vast cache of ancient remains. The Hayden site, identified in 2012 by Christina Curry Rogers' team from Macalester College and the BLM, represents a watershed moment in the history of North American paleontology. And that's my talk. Thank you. Does anybody have questions? Yes? It is. It is. Council Island is visible from there, and the ferry is right by there, the PN ferry. Yep. Yes?
Was Hayden very careful to describe the location where he found the fossils?
Was Hayden very careful to describe where he was?
Well, yes.
No, he wasn't, which is kind of frustrating. Again, we don't have the notes or letters from that day. He didn't keep them or he didn't send them on to his friends. So we don't have any first person narrative of I went up this creek or I went up this drainage and saw this from this ledge. So we're really dependent on his letters leading up to those days in October of 1855. Again, I think the last letter was July of 1855 to his friend Meek back east saying, I'm going here. And then the reports when he went back and said, basically he just said, I was at Dog Creek and near what became Council Island on the Missouri. So we were able to extrapolate that. So these geologists and paleontologists, I just wrote it up. So these students and professors were able now in 2012, 2013, to take all the geological clues and really kind of piece it together. And that combined with their collections matching almost exactly the collection sent back by Hayden really confirmed that this has to be the correct place. Yeah, it was good. It was good. They're really good at their jobs. Yes, Julie.
How could they tell the difference between a fossil and what looked like a rock? In one of your pictures, it looks just like a rock.
Yes, it's a trained eye, right? To be able to tell the difference between what's a rock and what's a fossil, what's an ancient bone. And I'm not particularly good at it. I'm not a trained geologist, but there certainly is a coloration difference, right? And a shape that emerges that is pretty much kind of indicative of this is a bone and not just a regular rock. But it's years of training that I certainly have not had. And, I think it's a quick eye. I've been on enough archaeological surveys, where me as the historian, the token historian along for the ride would walk, right past a stone tool or something that, the person behind me would go, you just walk right past it, look at that, and they'll be able to pick it up right off the screen. So I think, or off the ground. So I think that there is kind of a training where you can see a certain shading, a certain glisten to the rock that stands out or is differentiated from kind of the sand around it and the coloration around it that allows them to identify and pull these things out. It's a trained talent, I think. Yes.
The picture of the dinosaurs that you had up there,
Mm-hmm.
did Hayden identify all those dinosaurs, or were those identified later on and just said, here are the bones, he found them, and these are the dinosaurs? Or did he identify those?
A little bit of both. He didn't know exactly, what species they were. He was able to identify them as living during the Cretaceous period, and they were probably large scale or small scale. They might be in a theropod family, especially, or something that was like a fish scale, or a crocodile teeth, something that he could identify as similar to something that was in the present day. But it was Leedy, his friend back at the University of Pennsylvania, that then scoured through this collection and was able to describe them more fully and identify them as a particular species. Yay. Well, thank you very much for attending. It was so nice to see everybody. And now go down to Museum of the Rockies and learn more about dinosaurs. Excellent. Have a good day.